When you think of the book of Revelation, what comes to mind? I want to hear your thoughts. What comes to mind? And I'm gonna write these things on the board. End times, okay. What else? What comes to mind when you think of Revelation? Left behind. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about that next week. Second coming. What else? Hear Revelation. What? Creatures with eyeballs? Yeah. Seven horsemen, is that? Prophecy, okay. Tribulation. All right. Yeah. Pre-post, all that. Yeah. Heavens, yep. Okay. All right, let me add some. Worship. That should automatically come to mind when we think of Revelation. Witness. The faithful witness. The faithful witnesses. Throne. And probably the main one, the most central one to the book is the lamb, but a specific kind of lamb, a slain lamb. And we'll get into that obviously during the series. These are central to the book. Okay, let me ask another question. When you think of Revelation, what emotions do you have? How does it make you feel? Anything? Okay, yeah. Interesting, yeah. Confused. Oops. Scared. Anything else? Exciting, yeah, nice. Interesting, confused and scared, those are the most common ones. However, for the readers of Revelation or the hearers of Revelation in the first century, it wouldn't have been confusing at all. They would have understood completely what John was talking about. We're gonna talk about that a little bit today, and scared. Revelation was written to the churches in the first century. This was a message of hope and a message of encouragement in the midst of suffering. But it was also a message of challenge in the midst of compromise. And so we're going to see that as well. So throughout history, people have been a little bit kind of confused with Revelation and what we should actually do with Revelation. In fact, the church, the historical church, even they questioned Revelation's orthodoxy, whether it should even be included in the Bible at all. And many even banned it. Said that it shouldn't be taught in the churches. In fact, the great reformers, Martin Luther, John Calvin, they didn't think Revelation was good for the average Christian. In fact, Martin Luther said this. He said that Revelation is neither apostolic nor prophetic. He said, I can no way detect that the Holy Spirit produced it. Again, they are supposed to be blessed who keep what is written in the book, and yet no one even knows what that is. To say nothing of keeping it, Christ is neither taught nor known in it. That's what Martin Luther said. I disagree. So, a lot of times Christians, they'll approach the book of Revelation in a couple of different ways. They're extreme ways. So some people just completely avoid it. I think most Christians or even pastors just completely avoid Revelation because it's so strange to them. Or there are people that, probably you know these people, they'll just fixate on Revelation, trying to figure it out, trying to understand it. And in fact, when I've told other pastors that I'm going to be doing a series on Revelation, and everybody just kind of looks at me strange. They're like, we just won't touch the book, some of them have said. Good luck with that, I've heard. Could it be, this is just a question I want to ask, could it be that we're reading and understanding it incorrectly? Yeah, I think we have to think about that. What is Revelation? What is it? What was the message that John was communicating to these churches in the first century? How do we interpret it? How do we read it? How do we understand it? Those are the most important questions that we have to answer. We have to ask those questions. We have to answer those questions as we approach the book of Revelation. The most important questions that we have to ask. What actually is Revelation? How do we read it? How do we interpret it? How do we understand it? Because however you answer those questions determines a whole lot. A whole lot. It determines where you're headed, what direction you're headed in understanding the book and making sense of it. So I want to start here. When you walk into a library, like Allen County Public Library, you walk into any library, a public library, and you're looking for a specific book. How do you find it? Well, we know that in a library, things are grouped according to genre, right? Grouped according to, what type of literature they are. You've got, biographies over here and fiction here. You've got teen fiction, maybe periodicals, historical books, things like that. So if you want to find the book that you're looking for, you look for the type of literature, the genre. It's grouped according to genre. The thing that we have to understand, and we've talked about this before, is that the Bible isn't one book. The Bible tells a unified story, but it's a library of 66 books. It's a library of 66 books. And this library contains various types of literature, various types of genre. There's history, there's poetry, there's wisdom, there's prophecy, there's pastoral letters, and there's apocalyptic literature. And we'll talk about some of those things here in a second. So you have to understand the genre in order to understand what you're reading. And we interpret and you read and understand various genres in very different ways. So let me give you some examples. You open a book and you read Once Upon a Time, or you read And They Lived Happily Ever After. What do you think you're reading? A fairy tale, a work of fiction, right? You start to read Roses Are Red, Violets Are Blue. You're probably not going to continue reading because you want to find help with your gardening skills, right? No, you know what you're reading, right? What are you reading? You're reading poetry. We have to understand what we're reading. And it's the same with the Bible. It's the same with the Bible. Let me give you some examples. So in the Gospels, we read that Jesus said there was a man who scattered seeds. Well, who was the man? We've got to know who the man was, right? No, we know not to ask that question. We know that it's not a historical man, an historical person. We don't ask that question. What about the seeds? What type of seeds? Maybe we can find help with farming. No, we know we don't ask those questions. Well, why? Because we know that the genre is parable. It's a parable. We know that. Meant to illustrate a specific point. Let me give you another example. In the Proverbs, we read, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Okay, well, we know examples when that has proven false, right? I mean, we know of children who have been raised in the church, and they've been raised to know the Lord, and they have departed from it. And they have moved on from, they've headed in a completely different direction. Does that mean that the Bible can't be trusted? No, because we know what we're reading. That the Proverbs is wisdom literature. It's wisdom literature. That's the genre. It's a truism. It's a general principle to guide us towards wise living. The Proverbs are not to be taken as promises. We know that. So you get the genre wrong, or you just completely ignore the genre, and that will lead you in a wrong direction, and sometimes even in a dangerous direction. But you get the genre right. You might not understand everything you're reading. There might be some things that you're still confused about because of the language and the cultural divide, but at least you know you're headed in the right direction. So when reading the Bible, and especially when reading Revelation, we have to understand what we're reading. So important. And right from the beginning of Revelation, a lot of us have missed this. Right from the beginning of Revelation, John, the author, tells us exactly what we're reading. And he tells us how to read it. Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation from Jesus Christ, or your translation may say of Jesus Christ. It's from Jesus Christ, of Jesus Christ, about Jesus Christ, and we're going to really get into that next week. The revelation. This word revelation is the Greek word apocalypsis. Apocalypsis. So, revelation is, first of all, an apocalypse. So, when you hear the word apocalypse, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Destruction. Into the world. I mean, we can read books about, apocalypse today. We can watch movies. There are all kinds of movies out there about apocalypse. So for our minds, apocalypse means destruction. It means end of the world, but that's not what it means here. The Greek word for apocalypse means unveiling, uncovering. It means to reveal something that's been hidden. This is the apocalypse, the uncovering, the unveiling of Jesus. That's what this is. It's the apocalypse of Jesus. An apocalypse is a specific genre of literature that was really common back in those days. In fact, there are other examples, lots of examples of apocalyptic literature, even in the Bible. So, parts of Daniel from the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 7 through 12, apocalyptic literature. Mark 13 is known as the little apocalypse. Matthew chapter 24, Luke chapter 21, just a few examples. But there are also a ton of extra biblical writings, outside of the Bible, not in the scriptures. So there are apocalyptic writings like 1 Enoch and 4 Ezra. There's one called the Apocalypse of Peter. There's one called the Shepherd of Hermas. So we're able to read these apocalyptic literature, and we're able to gain an understanding of how we're supposed to approach apocalyptic literature. These are apocalyptic writings. This specific genre of apocalyptic literature is characterized by lots of things. Lots of things. In fact, you can actually read books specifically on how to interpret apocalyptic literature, if you're interested. I can give you some books. But here are just a few descriptions of apocalyptic literature. Apocalypses are usually communicated through a dream or a vision mediated by an angel. So we see that right here in Revelation, the first few verses of Revelation. The revelation from Jesus, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John. So we see that right in the beginning. Mediated through an angel. This is a dream or vision mediated by an angel. Apocalyptic literature is also characterized by the use of highly symbolic language and images. Highly symbolic language and images. Apocalyptic literature communicates through the use of symbols and metaphors. It communicates a message through metaphors and symbols that aren't meant to be taken literally. And sometimes when I say that, people don't quite understand, and there's some pushback. And sometimes people will say, but you're not taking the Bible seriously if you don't take it literally. How many of you heard that before? The opposite is true. The opposite is true. You're taking it more seriously because we shouldn't take something literally that the author didn't intend for it to be taken literally. In other words, and this is one of the most important things to understand when you're interpreting the scriptures, it can't mean something other than what the author intended it to mean. It can't mean something other than that. We can't find our own meanings apart from what the author intended. And so part of understanding the scriptures and faithfully approaching the scriptures and faithfully studying the scriptures is to understand the genre, to understand it in the way the author intended it to be understood. And that takes lots of work. And thankfully, we've got Bible scholars and theologians who do that. But that's taking the Bible literarily. And that's taking the Bible seriously. And so, once again, John gives us a clue. He tells us right here. The revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place, he made it known by sending his angel. He made it known, or maybe, depending on what translation you're using, made it known. It may say he signified it. That's what it means in the Greek. He signified it to John, which means he symbolized it. He made it known through symbols. Now this doesn't mean that it wasn't real. It doesn't mean that what John saw, the vision that he saw, wasn't real. But what's real, we have to understand this. What's real is what's being communicated through the symbols. The message being communicated through the symbols is what's real. So as we study Revelation throughout this series, we're going to see various numbers used symbolically. The number 7. The number 7 is throughout. The number 1,000. There are lots of numbers that are going to be used symbolically to communicate something. There are colors that are used. We're going to read about the beast of the earth and the beast of the sea. We're going to read about the dragon. We're going to read about Babylon. We're going to read about the faithful witnesses. These are all representative of something. And we have to discern what's being communicated through the symbols, through the images. So, also with apocalyptic literature, there's this sense of urgency. This is one of the characteristics of apocalyptic literature. There's this urgency. And so, once again, we're still in the first verse. The revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. Must soon take place. And so, throughout Revelation, we're going to see references of time. References of time. And some have used these references to try to calendarize, the events of Revelation. This happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And so they use it and they try to predict, what's coming in the future, future dates and times and things like that. And listen, besides Jesus telling us we shouldn't do that, he tells us quite clearly in Acts chapter 1, it's not for you to know. It's not for you to know the dates and the times. And besides the fact that all these predictions that people have made throughout the years have been completely false, besides all that, that's not the point of apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is not to be taken chronologically. It's not a timeline of future events. That's not how you read apocalyptic literature. Now, we're gonna geek out a little bit, so put on your thinking caps. There's chronos time and there's kairos time. Have you ever heard of this? Chronos time, kairos time. Maybe you remember back to your school days. So chronos time is all about a specific amount of time. Chronos time, a specific amount of time. Like days and hours. It's about the clock. It's about the calendar. That's chronos time. And then there's kairos time. And kairos time refers to a moment in time. Kind of like harvest time or a season of time or an opportune time or a soon kind of time. And throughout the Bible, we see that God is on a completely different timeline. Right? He's on a completely different timeline than we are. In Revelation, we see that he's a God who was and is to come. We'll see that. And so Revelation is welcoming followers of Jesus, these believers in these churches in the first century, to see according to God's time. See according to God's time. And this is really important. There's an age of time dominated by the curse of sin and death and the evil powers of this world. And there's an age of time dominated by the rule and reign of Jesus, the age of new creation that has already been set in motion when Jesus rose from the dead. It's already been set in motion. It's here. It's already here. It's begun. But it's not yet. God's kingdom is here. It's arrived. But it's not fully and finally established yet. The new creation has begun. But once again, it's not fully and finally made known yet. Since the resurrection, we have been living in the end times. It's kairos. The kairos type of time. The urgent time. The opportune time. The soon kind of time. And so with this urgency language in apocalyptic literature, specifically in Revelation, the churches that John was writing to and the church today, we're invited to open our eyes. Revelation, right? It's a surprise. Open your eyes. Open your eyes to the not yet and live in that reality in the present time. Here and now. The time is now. These things will be soon taking place. And as Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is near. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that Greek word is the same word we have in Revelation for soon. For soon. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Apocalyptic literature is meant to ignite our imaginations of an unseen reality and live according to that reality today. So let me give you an example. This is a for instance. Later on in Revelation, we're going to read these words. Fallen. Fallen is Babylon the Great. And as we're going to see, Babylon symbolizes the Roman Empire. That's the world in which they were living in the first century. The Romans were governing them, oppressing them. Fallen is Babylon the Great, they would hear in this revelation. And once again, it symbolized the Roman Empire. And because it's a symbol, it symbolizes all oppressive empires throughout history, even today. And so when they heard these words from John, Rome was still in power, right? Rome was still ruling them and oppressing them with a mighty hand. So John was speaking of a future event as if it had already happened. Fallen is Babylon. Fallen is Babylon. And that would have been incredible words of hope and encouragement for the churches living under oppressive Babylonian-like rule. Fallen is Babylon, he said. You can count on it. You can be assured that Babylon, that Rome, that all evil empires will be fallen, that all evil will fall. It has fallen according to God's timeline. And as difficult as it may be, you could live in that reality today, victoriously. The genre of apocalyptic literature uses a lot of hyperbolic language, a lot of graphic language and images to spark this imagination to that greater reality. It's something the first century churches needed desperately. And it's something that we still need today in our churches. Hope for God's ultimate justice and victory over evil. Now, Revelation is known as a hybrid genre, which means it's more than just one type of genre, one type of literature. It's apocalypse, but it's also prophecy. The revelation from Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what soon must take place, he made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who testifies to everything he saw. That is, the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it. So, and not just here, but throughout Revelation, it's called a work of prophecy. But what is prophecy? We've got lots of examples in the Bible. In fact, in the Old Testament, we've got 17 books of prophecy. And so John, who's the author, and we don't really know who John was. Some think that it's John the Apostle who wrote the Gospel of John and 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, but we don't know. There were a lot of people named John back in that day. Some think he was another leader of the churches in that day. We're not really sure. It doesn't matter. But John, we know, was a Jew. And being a Jew, he describes what he sees in this revelation by using what he already knows, which is the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. And so in Revelation, there are over 500 allusions or references to the Old Testament. Some scholars think there are even way more than that. At least 500 references, allusions to the Old Testament. So John was very, very familiar with the Old Testament. Now, when we think prophecy, what comes to mind? We often think prediction. But prophecy, especially in the Old Testament, is not primarily about prediction. Prophecy is about a call towards greater faithfulness. That's what prophecy is. Prophets weren't future tellers. Prophets were people who declared a message from the Lord. That's what prophets were. And so John used similar language, similar images, and similar language from the Old Testament prophets, what he was familiar with, to do the same thing the prophets were doing in the Old Testament. To speak words of comfort and hope and salvation. God's got your back. God's going to come through. God's going to vindicate you. But also, and in fact, the majority of the time, to speak messages of warning, messages of challenge, messages of judgment. You better shape up. You better repent. You better change your ways. You're headed on a path towards destruction. And so prophets in the Old Testament called people towards greater faithfulness. And that's exactly what John is doing in Revelation. He's calling the churches in the first century towards greater faithfulness. In his book on Revelation called Reversed Thunder, Eugene Peterson wrote this, Reversed Thunder. It's a great book. It's a small book. I highly recommend it. He said this: everything in the Revelation can be found in the previous 65 books of the Bible. The Revelation adds nothing of substance to what we already know. The truth of the gospel is already complete, revealed in Jesus Christ. There's nothing new to say on the subject, but there's a new way to say it. There's a new way to say it. That's what Revelation is. He says, I read the Revelation not to get more information, but to revive my imagination. So if we're not familiar with the rest of the Bible, especially with the Old Testament, we're not going to understand Revelation very well. We're not going to understand how it was meant to be understood. We've got to look at the rest of the Bible to understand what we're reading in Revelation, and so we'll do that throughout this series. So, hybrid genre. Revelation is apocalypse. It's also prophecy, but it's also a letter. It's a pastoral letter. It's an epistle. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia, grace and peace to you from him who is, and who was, and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits before the throne, and from Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness, the firstborn from the dead, the ruler of the kings of the earth. He's addressing the 7 churches, right? This is a letter. It begins like a letter, and it ends like a letter, just like the other New Testament epistles that we're more familiar with, just like those New Testament letters. And so just like the other New Testament letters were written to specific Jesus followers or specific groups of Jesus followers in these churches in the first century. So was Revelation. Revelation was written to these 7 churches in a specific time, in a specific place, addressing specific issues they were facing. Once again, they were being ruled by the Romans who had just recently destroyed the Jewish temple in 70 A.D. Some believers were facing persecution and suffering. Many more than that were giving in and actually compromising and following in the way of Babylon instead of in the way of Jesus. Just as John used a lot of allusions to the Old Testament, references to the Old Testament, he also used Roman political propaganda. He used a lot of political propaganda, Roman imperial political propaganda, and he applied it to Jesus. And so Revelation is a very political book. Revelation presents a very clear contrast between the ways of Babylon and the ways of Jesus, and the way he wants his faithful witnesses, the churches, to live in the midst of Babylon. And John speaks in highly charged political ways, pitting the kingdom of God against the Roman Empire and all the kingdoms of this world. And the churches in the first century, they would have gotten it. They would have understood what he was talking about. But it's easy for us to miss those things 2,000 years later. Let me give you another example. And I've seen this illustration used before. I've heard this. Other pastors have used this. Maybe you've heard this illustration. But maybe many of you are familiar with political cartoons. You've seen political cartoons. I was going to show some of them, but they're all very offensive. So I decided not to show them. But, in these political cartoons, you've got talking donkeys, you've got talking elephants, you've got eagles, you have Uncle Sam, you've got Donald Trump, you've got Biden, you've got all kinds of politicians, and they're saying all kinds of things to each other. Kind of crazy stuff, right? Can you imagine 2,000 years from now, people looking at our political cartoons and trying to figure out what in the world was going on in America in the 21st century? What in the world was going on? Trying to interpret what's happening in these political cartoons. It's similar. It's similar when we look at the book of Revelation 2,000 years later. Trying to understand some of this political propaganda that was going on. They would have understood it. Revelation 1:1, let me read again. The revelation from or of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, who testifies to everything he saw, that is, the word of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take it to heart. Take it to heart. Or your translation may say, blessed are those who keep what is written in it. Keep what is written in it. Take it to heart. Keep what is written doesn't mean to keep it and to keep it safe or keep it safe and hidden away. What does keep mean? Keep what is written in it. It means to use it, to do something with it, to apply it to everyday life. And so this is really important for us to know. In order to use it, they heard this letter read to them. They heard this revelation read to them. To use it and apply it, how would they use it and apply it? They most definitely would have understood what was being read to them, right? The church in the first century would have understood it. The churches in the first century. They would have been able to apply it. And once again, we have to be reminded of this when it comes to interpretation. It can't mean something other than what it meant to the original audiences. So the churches in the first century, they would have understood. And our understanding of what is being symbolized, this is so important, our understanding today of what is being symbolized has to be rooted in their understanding. But here's the thing. That's not the way the majority of us has been taught to read and understand Revelation, right? And we're going to talk a lot about this next week. That's not how most of us have been taught to read and understand Revelation. Most of us, I would say, in this room have been taught that it's a certain code that we have to unlock. It's a code that we have to figure out that tells us about the future. And so we hear strange things like, you read about the locusts. And the locusts, what the locusts are? The locusts are Apache helicopters. Right? And we hear all kinds of things like that. All that is prediction and speculation. And that's not authoritative. That's not authoritative. It's just a bunch of guesses. Once again, we'll get into that next week a little bit. But some of the stuff in Revelation just gets lost on us, right? But we do our best to understand the original message to the churches in the first century. And they would have understood this stuff. They would have been able to understand it and apply it to their lives. They knew what Babylon represented. They knew what the great prostitute represented. They knew who the beast and the dragon were referring to. They also would have understood the implications for the churches of that day. And so when we do our best to understand the implications for the first century churches, first and foremost, then we can better understand the implications for the church throughout history and for us today. G.K. Chesterton, who was a Christian apologist from the late 1800s and the early 1900s, he said this: "Though St. John the Evangelist saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature so wild as one of his own commentators." And I agree. Revelation is apocalypse, it's prophecy, and it's letter. It's a letter. And if we don't look at the book of Revelation through those three lenses, then it's going to lead us towards some inaccurate and crazy and even dangerous and monstrous ways of understanding and applying this very powerful book. So, I'm going to give you my summary of the book of Revelation, and Grace read some of it earlier. So I'm going to give you my short summary, and then I'm going to give you my one sentence summary, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of an extended summary. Here's my very, very short summary of the book of Revelation. Revelation is an invitation to open our eyes. It's a revelation. It's an unveiling. It's a revealing. It's an invitation to open our eyes. Now, my one sentence invitation that Grace read earlier is that Revelation is an invitation to open our eyes to see things the way they really are and live according to that reality. My extended summary. It's also an invitation to open our eyes and discern and resist the ways of Babylon and in all the kingdoms of this world, and live according to God's kingdom through our worship and our witness. Very, very prominent themes throughout Revelation, calling the churches to worship and witness. Revelation is an invitation to open our eyes to see that Jesus has conquered and he has won. He's won the victory, and he will one day ultimately win the victory. He's conquered and he's won. And we are to live victoriously in the way of Jesus. In the way of Jesus, the way that he has modeled for us. And here's the thing. Here's what we're going to discover, that the way that Jesus modeled for us is going to be very, very surprising. Very surprising to many of us, and really challenging. This is going to be a fun, and it's going to be a challenging series. So next week we're going to look at specific ways that Revelation has been understood throughout the years, and how we've been influenced, especially here in America, how we've been influenced by these ways of interpreting Revelation. We're going to look at some of those ways, and we're going to talk about the rapture, and we're going to look further into chapter 1, and we're going to discover what Revelation is really about, who Revelation is really about. In the meantime, here are the things that I would ask of you, because this is going to be a challenging book, a challenging series. I ask that you do three things. Read it. A lot of us, a lot of people haven't read it. They've just been taught it. Read it. Read it several times throughout this series. And if you can, read it all in one setting, because the churches in the first century that would have heard this, it would have been read to them. In fact, some people think it would have been presented to them. It would have been acted out in front of them as they presented it, all in one setting for them to hear as a letter. So read it. Read it. Read through it several times. And talk about it. Talk about what you're learning. Talk about the things that the things that you don't understand. Talk about it with other Jesus followers. If you're a part of a community group, talk about it in your group. And then ask questions. Ask questions. In fact, if there's something that I've said that you don't understand or you have a question about, you use your connection card and jot that question down, and or just see me after the service or send me an email, and we'll do our best to figure it out and to find some answers. Now, we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, right? And here's the thing: some of us are going to disagree on some of this stuff as well. But we're going to do our best. We're going to do our best to discover what Revelation is about. And so here's my prayer as we go throughout this series. And this is my prayer. I pray that we will all hear it. That we'll hear it and we'll take to heart what is written in this revelation of Jesus, and that we'll keep it. We'll keep it and we'll use it and we'll apply it. In fact, will you read this with me? Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. So, here's what we're going to do now. I'm going to ask that you just spend a few minutes, if you're comfortable with this, spend a few minutes talking to the person next to you, maybe someone you came with. Maybe you know the person, maybe you don't. What have you learned today? And what do you look forward to learning and understanding throughout this series? If you feel comfortable. If you don't, sit and reflect on these questions on your own. And then I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to chat about these things. And then I would ask that you take communion together. If you're sitting next to a person, feel free to take it together. If you want, if you're comfortable. If not, take it on your own. So after a few minutes, I'll put this piece of scripture up. And if you want to, as you're sharing with the people next to you, just say, "This is the body which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And say, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me." And then just share communion together. I think sometimes we're used to communion being just real reflective, but if you look at the kind of the history of the way the early church took communion, it was in the midst of a meal of celebration, and they would have been sitting around at the table together and celebrating and talking about Jesus and talking about what he's doing in their lives, and they would have shared communion together. So if you feel comfortable, go ahead and do that. So I'll put these questions up, and then I'll move to the next slide, and then you can take communion, and then we'll sing one final song together. Go for it.